Okay, I think you all know who I am. I've been around for a couple of years.
Wrong place.
Patrick likes to talk money, so we'll talk money. So, and basically the reason you care about money is because unless eComStation is making some dollars, there will be no eComStation. Now, because we're small, we don't need, Mensis doesn't need a lot of money coming in, but they need enough that it makes sense for them to continue to work. And also they need enough coming in so that the return on investment makes sense relative to what they could get from other businesses. And, you know, Mensis is sort of invisible to us. Yeah, we know them as ECS, but they do a lot of other stuff. And, you know, they're just very entrepreneurial.
And you said that it was proprietary, how many copies are sold or whatever?
Well,
Why is
I'm
that?
not going to tell you, because you don't need to know.
No, but I mean, can you give us some sense of, is it in millions or thousands?
I
Or?
don't know the exact. I know, you know, I know. Roderick says stuff to me, and I immediately forget it, because it's stuff that's really not important. The thing is, basically, generalities is not going to, you're not going to disappear the year because there's no money coming.
Now, they're out in Germany, right?
Pardon?
No. Holland?
Mensis, no, they're not German, they're Dutch. Please don't call them German. They speak Dutch. Because they live in Europe, they're like all the Europeans, they speak lots of languages. But their home language is Dutch, although I suspect they speak English about 60% of the time because the educational system requires it, it turns out. But basically, 80% of the Dutch are fluent in English. You know, speaking fluent, reading fluent. Accents will vary. And if you look, you can see, like Joachim, his written English is excellent. And Project, not so much. But I think with Project, it's a little bit dyslexia. He's got a little bit of that, and just it's mental with him. He doesn't pay that much attention. He's always on to the next thing. And I can relate to that because I do it too. I have my typos that I never see. And I know what they're doing because I'm not watching. And if I go back and proofread, I'll take the extra T's out and stuff like that. But anybody who's corresponding knows there's lots of extra T's in my code. It's just automatic. I don't think about it. It's just there.
Sitting up here, this thing has been dropping me.
So, things are moving along, and there's growth. You know, even though we're in this business, and you got to remember, the reality is here, IBM's doing nothing. Okay, anything that's done is going to be done via Mensis and the eComStation community.
You can't find the page.
Now, that actually means it actually puts a little more pressure on end users. And basically, it means if you want to be an end user, don't have any real expectations, because there's a limit. You must help the developers. Period. And that means, put a little more, just learn a little. That's all. And there's lots you can do that's not programming, not developing. But there's, and we'll get into that later. We're going to detail the kinds of things you can do. But the reality is the only way things are going to thrive is to have a little bit higher percentage of developer to end user. And this is how the other niche operating systems, such as the Atari and the DDoS, survive. They have a higher percentage of developers to end users. There's a few out there that are pure end users, but by and large, they must help the developers. And that's one of the reasons that Linux grew. Linux, because it was a technical operating system to start with, and it was a bit of a college project, although I think it was really more of a hobby project, it had a high percentage of developers. And that allowed them to get the traction they needed to grow. Now you find people that, they buy their Windows machines, the first thing they do is they install Ubuntu because it's Linux, they learn about it, and it's easy enough for them to get by with it without a lot of technical knowledge. But that's all because the developers are doing the work on it. And there's a lot of other reasons it happened too. In other words, they ended up getting funding because of strategic reasons. Companies like IBM and that found it worthwhile to invest money. It's not all developers off in the corner that are doing Linux. Now, why do folks buy this stuff? Well, corporations have one set of reasons, and end users have another. Basically, corporations buy ECS for the same reason they buy it. They have a business problem they need to solve. And in our case, the typical business problem is that they've got a line of business application. Everybody here know what I mean when I say line of business? Yeah. Probably heard it enough times. And interestingly, you find these line-of-business applications still running on ECS 2.1. Those of you who probably never installed. Well, no. There's always an exception. I said most. Heck, even that, we actually, I think we ran into a 1.2 somewhere. Some server, yeah. And the reason they do that is because in the business world, things last forever. They basically last because you can't make them last anymore. Because in the business world, you aren't buying one, you're buying 1,000, which means your capital cost is not trivial. And additionally, these applications are large, which meant there was a large amount of funded development that went into it over a number of years. And taking that development and redoing it on another platform is usually a non-trivial expense. And there's usually other issues too, because not a lot of these things are talking specialized hardware, which means you've got drivers for them. And a lot of times, some of them are even talking with hardware that's no longer available. So you can't just replace your platform, you got to replace all your hardware and all your ancillary hardware, plus train everybody and all that. So there's actually quite a bit of incentive to stay with OS2, ECS, or stay with OS2 for these applications. The disincentive is that it's hard to find people that know anything about it. And it's not that they don't exist, it's that they're invisible. Like 2 or 3 of you guys here that just showed up that have been using for ECS OS2 forever, and no one knows your name. It's because you've been hiding wherever you hide. That's just the way it is. It's not. This is not a criticism. This is a statement of how the ECS and the OS2 community always has been. At the end
Even just sitting here.
The corporate level, in the past, when IBM was pushing it, they talked like that.
This one.
Because there are enterprises, they talk to other enterprises, they have marketing guys that show up. And that's just the way it works. Okay, the other thing that causes, one of the typical triggers is the hardware thing. That really triggers them. Not so much they want to do anything to the application, but they got this whole artificial intelligence. And they've done everything they can to find ICE-based systems and that run the hardware they run. And I'll give you some stories a little later about some of the systems we've actually had to fix and make work. And it's just, you do what you can do. Now, in terms of where our sales are, I don't know. Roger tells me they're mostly in the U.S. I guess that's true, but I also know of several large purchasers over in Europe that are actually installing new hardware and new systems that they're actually maintaining on OS2. They're actually changing the code. Most of the ones we see, the vast majority are not doing anything to the code. There's a couple, but the majority of them they have code, it's there, they just want to run.
How about China and India?
Huh?
How about China and
We'll get to that. That's the global thing. Interestingly, a lot of these systems end up installed in the Far East because that's where the factories are. We got one customer that does semiconductor inspection. These systems all go into Japan. Some of them are running the Japanese NLS, but a lot of them are still running English. They have enough stuff in their application that they do Japanese. And for most of these customers, the ones that we actually have to put a lot of effort into, virtualization is not an option. Because the hardware they're talking to doesn't have the virtual pass-through. Now, if we were better at VirtualBox, we could be doing that stuff, building the VirtualBox pass-through drivers. But we don't. So, now we do have some that virtualize. We've got a couple out there that they're basically running some sort of, one of them I can think of is an insurance app of some sort. And they have DB2 servers, they run DB2 instances in one virtual, and the desktop application runs in another virtual, and the desktop itself is probably Windows at this point in time. But, we got them running, and it's like everything else. Corporate customers are no different than end users. You fix the problem, they go silent again. You haven't heard from them in a year and a half. Every now and then, hey, how those guys doing? I haven't heard from them. They're just running. And, they have most of them have plans to migrate at some point in time, because eventually what will happen is their business needs will change, and there'll be enough incentive to re-implement that don't get rid of the old stuff, add a company word features and all that. New features, they don't want to do that in OS 2 because they can't get developers. So when they got a new feature, they do something silly like convert to SAC. And they throw away everything, spend billions of dollars in integration. Then they go away. But that's pretty much why these guys buy. And we understand that, and we just serve their needs.
I have the sound here.
Okay, you guys, since most of you are sort of more end users and consumers, you've got your applications that you really like, and you don't want to give them up. Everybody, most of them have a hot button. There's some folks really like PM views and mail. There's me, I like Impos 2, and a bunch of other stuff. Of course, I'm a little different in the sense that I run a lot of different stuff. Like my choice don't run with Windows. I just don't have a need for it. But I had to. It's just another operating system. And the other thing that reason you guys like the way the WPS works, even though as time goes on, the other desktops get more data directed because it's not built in. WPS and SOM and all that, it's never quite the same. So that's it. And the other thing is, which I didn't bother, I should have mentioned, but I did, is a lot of you guys believe in security through obscurity. You run your browser here, and the Flash doesn't work as well, but then again, you don't have to worry about this week's security exploit. The worst that will happen is take your browser down. It's not going to take your data away. And I don't know, some of you might have other ideas that I've left off of this. Any other releases you guys run?
If someone steals my hard drive, they probably don't even know how to read HPFS.
There is that, although, but one thing, if somebody steals your hard drive, they're a professional criminal, they'll know. It really depends on who steals it. Again, that's the security.
Well, I just like using OS 2 because I believe in there being a large amount of different OSs, and that keeps innovation going. So, you should never funnel down into 1, 2, or 3 OSs that are in existence, because you can never funnel down the expectations of millions and millions and billions of people into such a small subset. Everybody works a different way, everybody thinks a different way, and everybody has a different process of doing things. So I believe when it comes to OSs, the more the merrier. So I don't want a great one to disappear.
Yeah. But unfortunately, there's a lot of disincentives to continuing with those two. The biggest one is, at this point in time, is lack of access to the sources that are needed to really develop it and maintain it. Now, the option there is to re-implement, but then where do you find enough developers with the proper skill set to actually do it? But I don't think OS 2 is going to go away until there's simply no more 32-bit systems, or no more 64 or 128-bit systems that can do 32-bit virtual. It will always be there, because you take a look at the other niche operating systems like Wind River, QNX. I can just go down the list. But most of you guys don't know about. There's probably at least 1,000 operating systems out there that have some market penetration, especially at the commercial level. Because they've got their infrastructure to support that. They've got a customer base that needs support. Now, over time, they'll have the same problem. They'll be less. Now, QNX is not what they were 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In DEOS, I haven't really paid that much attention to know if you're thriving or surviving or what.
Yeah, they're thriving pretty well. They have a similar type of infrastructure for developers that Linux has, and I think their developers, even though they're not quite the same amount as the Linux guys, they care about it more, and it's not because of philosophical reasons and religious reasons about the licensing. They care about the way things work, and it's simple, and it makes sense because a lot of it was just that they got rid of a lot of legacy and started fresh, and so a lot of people care more about it. So they're thriving pretty well. Google actually sponsors a lot of stuff of theirs. It's the Haku project.
Okay, there's that, yeah. And then there's also, React OS is sort of coming along, and that's basically, that's really a sort of a Windows clone more than anything else.
Right.
But it's a clean license Windows. We'll see how far it gets. But the thing is, there's enough people in the world, that there's no real need for there to be only one operating system. And, even Windows, if you actually look at what they're doing, their market share has dropped because people have come along and got some traction against it. But it's still massive. That inertia means it's really hard to really do significant displacement.
I think Google
But
is
the thing is,
their
as long as
biggest
there's alternatives, there's alternatives. In other words, for me, I don't care that, in the desktop, Windows is still probably 80-85%.
That's not.
The fact is,
The desktop is not where it is anymore.
and that's not really true. The thing is, in the sense that the desktop is changing. The tablet is now becoming the desktop. The smartphone is becoming the desktop.
Yeah, well, okay, if you want to call those desktops, but
It is.
it's not like Windows
Don't
in the
forget.
tablet area.
No. Microsoft has a problem because they've never really been able to do a phone that people like yet. I understand that. I understand what their problems are. And in the server area, maybe they're 50%. I think the last numbers I read, really, they're that high.
Yeah.
Because there's the same thing like 20 years ago where folks were IBM shops. Now there's places that are Windows shops.
Yeah.
I got family that works in those things, and develops for it, and that's just the way it is. They don't. If there's a Windows solution, they use it because it keeps it. Even though there are costs associated with it, there are also savings.
Just wanted to add another reason why the Windows sales are so high is because I know an attorney or a lot of professionals that keep throwing away their machines and buying another one quickly because they have to get something done and they just break.
Well,
And they get a new license sale.
You're dealing with a commodity. It's a toaster.
Yeah.
In other words, how many people, yes, you'll find the gamers who will install a new version of Windows on stuff, but the vast majority of Windows users, they buy a piece of hardware, it's got the OS on it, and that's what they use. The only reason they upgrade it is for security fixes. If it weren't for the security stuff, they wouldn't even be upgrading because they have no need for it.
And just replace the one when it breaks.
Well, they wouldn't do it. They don't need to upgrade.
Oh my God.
Okay, well, what did we do that was sort of new, really new to as opposed to stuff that was just new? Biggest one from an end user point of view that actually caused trouble was the disk checker. The 2.0 disk checker was fraught with potential for failure on the end user's part. So that was cleaned up a little bit. They put a GUI around it, and the areas where the user could make mistakes, they got fixed.
You mean that thing when you're installing that says you want to check the...
Yeah, and it didn't listen to you really all the time on 2.0. Yeah, exactly. Stuff happens. This happened. This is where the end users, when the betas were coming out, if they'd actually paid more attention instead of just installed it and used it, they might have helped us. But there was one of these things. It's just we didn't know until it was actually operating wider. Because mostly what happens, even with the betas, people install and turn them into production systems. Because that's what OS2 users do. They're not going to install it 5 different ways, checking the different options, and QA testers for us, because that's not their focus. It would help if they were. You go buy a $200 machine and QA, use it as your killer machine, or stick an extra drive in there. But everybody has different things pulling at the time. The other thing we did is we integrated with AirBoot. Fixed it up. There were some issues with it with large drives. We fixed those and cleaned it up a little bit. Probably could use a better GUI, but it's okay the way it is. The benefit of AirBoot is that it allows us to do things we'll never be able to do with Boot Manager. I looked at patching up Boot Manager to fix these problems, and there's just more work than it was worth. We had code that was basically working with AirBoot. Now, OS2 users in general complain about change. They say they want change, but they don't. So there's the crew that says, "Well, I want my boot manager," and it's optional. And if you have hardware that doesn't need AirBoot and software, they continue to use Boot Manager. It does what it does, and it's pretty much bug-free in that area.
Dave, how well is AirBoot integrated into DFC?
Very well. In what sense do you mean? If DFC doesn't break anything that DFC does?
DFC works with Boot Manager.
Well, DFC will install the manager, but doesn't necessarily.
It doesn't. No, it does. It can update.
It can update the
There's no need for it. This is, again, Jan will probably never add that because the reason that DFC has Boot Manager functionality is because Boot Manager's own functionality is, it does what it does.
Yeah.
I won't use bad words.
I'm not thrilled with everything.
Huh?
I'm not thrilled with everything.
Right.
And I can't use it, by the way.
You can't?
Well, of course not.
Okay.
I was an employee at one time of the U.S. government.
That's right.
Oh, they took that out.
Exactly.
No, that's all gone. And
I'm
like
sorry,
most of the expletives.
That's why I don't use it. Steve,
When he went GPL, all that stuff changed.
is there a reason why you didn't consider Grub?
Yep, a lot harder to use for us. And Grub doesn't do the things we need. Grub, you will notice that there's a few, every 3 weeks, someone who doesn't watch the news comes up and says, I want to install ECS and use Grub in my loader.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they don't look at the history first to find out why it'll never work. They just come along and...
Well, I know it doesn't work out of the box, but I was just thinking that
It can't
Grub,
work.
being a
It can't
more
work.
universal,
It's hard to force.
Well, it's not really, no. Grub is only
Grub.
universal where it's universal. Bootloaders used widely in the Linux world, depending on which distribution you use.
Mm-hmm.
Grub's pretty pervasive, but it's not the only solution. And also there's Grub 2, which is sort of getting knocked out. And there's still ILOs out there playing. But the reason it wasn't used because it really didn't solve our problems. And it would have needed quite a bit of work. One of the things it doesn't do is it doesn't do the Win13 trick. That everybody needs to know they're using LBA. Regardless of what you think about this little way of doing things, it is the way it works. OS2 loaders going to go look for that stuff. So, but this, and the other part, my friends over at Windows decided they didn't like the idea of hidden primaries. And I actually agree with them.
Yeah.
Primaries never should have existed. But then again, you've heard my story about the lab rat, aka the PC. That escaped. And here we are. We're finally getting to the point, how many years later, where things are starting to become
What they should have been.
not part of this, not part of what we have to worry about anymore. But we still do. And it's all because that stuff's there, and once you get an install software base that depends on it, that stuff will stick around for a long, long time.
The beta air boot was really ugly. What you produced is better.
Yeah.
But it still looks like eComStation was written by Martin Kiewitz.
Yeah.
I don't like that.
No.
That's a problem.
He's not a GUI he's not a GUI program, but that'll actually, what's going to happen. We'll talk about a little bit more what's going to happen with Urban, because there's a plan for that.
Okay.
And this stuff will all get fixed.
Yeah.
The benefit here is that you've got something that you can use on your Vista preloads and your Windows 7 preloads, and we know that you guys have it. Because people complain. If they weren't complaining, we wouldn't be fixing the problem. Like I say, you don't tell us we have got a problem. I'm backed up and happy. I go do other things. The other thing we did is you've got AHCI support. Now, that's the new nice standard controller for SATA drives. Okay? SATA is really used interchangeably to describe many things. You use it to describe a disk drive, but it really isn't the proper description. What really SATA is a transport mechanism that these disk drives use both on the electrical and the logical level to talk to a PC. Now, in the past, everybody and his brother had a SATA controller. And they were similar, but they weren't similar. And then you see an implementation like what you have with Danis code, which has got basically tables after tables after tables that are specific to a given SATA controller. AHCI does for disk controllers what USB did for us. It gives you a standard interface. Now, the vendors may not like it in the sense that now they have to compete based on commodities and better production and all that sort of stuff. There's not this room for proprietary value add. But it means that Thielens, who did the driver for us, could write one driver that doesn't care about PCI IDs. It doesn't need to. All it cares about is the class device, just like we do with the USB. With USB devices, there's no PCI ID program. It doesn't need it. You might need it for errata, but you don't need it to actually run the chips. Except it doesn't work right in the standard way. But often with that, I don't think we don't have any probing in there at all. The IBM drivers, they had some probing for some of their USB drivers. They didn't really need it. And it's working well. We've had one refresh on it, but in general, it just works. Found a very, very weird little bug that only our friend LVM made happen. You think about how most caching systems are going to work. Everything's to be aligned nicely on either 256 or 4K batteries because everything's page-oriented and all that. Well, our friends LVM managed to allocate a buffer on the stack where they read in I think it was, might have been an master boot record, but it could have also been the LVM data. And this was embedded in the structure, and it was on the line, which meant it could be on the byte memory. And of course, things stopped working because they didn't. The guys in the feelings missed the little bit where things had to be word aligned. Now, why the spec says word aligned rather than something more that makes more sense these days with double word aligned or page aligned, I don't know. But nevertheless, they had to do some work to do some scatter gathering at the buffer level to get things aligned right. And that was fixed, but very few people see that. It's a weird thing that it only happens in some systems, but when it happens to you, it's repeatable. The other thing we did, which basically David and I did the day before Warpstock Europe. We get there, David and I are all fully jet lagged because he came out of Las Vegas, I come out of California, and we're 12 hours away from where we're normally sleeping. And we said, we need this power manager turned into a product. And so we sat down and turned it into a product. And it shipped. And the benefit is that like this thing here, without the power manager, it had battery like about an hour and a half, which is about right for a T60 of this age. And I'll get 2.5. Now, obviously, if I've got something that's really compute intensive or driving to this, where the power manager doesn't get a chance to kick in, then not so good. But for general browsing and stuff like that, it really makes a big difference. That was a standalone app. And then I said something to David to me, really, should we put this in ACPI? And David, in his inimitable fashion, said, that's not a part of ACPI. It's just a standalone utility. Pretty soon we do. So somehow or another, I had my effect over time. Because the reality is while it's not technically part of ACPI, it is part of ACPI until it works with ACPI. So it's now part of the daemon and all that. And we had a little bit of cleanup to do to get the GUIs right, and you really need something that you can monitor. When we did the first version, we had the VI on Windows, so you could watch it change that way. But we really need a little something. You can sort of see it in the reverse fashion. If you go watch your pulse, as the power usage goes down, the meter goes up. Nice inverse relationship. Think about it, it has to be that way. Anybody not understand why that happens? Okay. If you lower your frequency on your system, which is basically power, and you're still doing work amount of X, you're going to take twice as many cycles to get that work done, which means your system is twice as busy. But of course, since it's running slower, it uses less power.
Yeah, it makes the GUI sluggish, at least at first.
Once the new ACPI betas come out, if that still happens, we'll look at changing the curve because it's pretty simplistic right now. And some of that is limited, as you know, to what ACPI can do.
Right.
And some of it is because there's no server. It's just a simple algorithm you can look at. But possibly you put a little sine wave server in there, you can smooth things out, do a little estimation. We did this 10 seconds ago, maybe I better start. There's a lot of things you can do. Once you actually start looking at modeling what really happens. And some of the chipsets, too. Some of the chipsets, there's two options in how you do power management in ACPI. And the chipset vendor gets to determine which ones are there. And one of them is pretty darn coarse. It's it's like 3 settings or something, 3 or 4 settings. And the other one's got about 8 or 10. It's still not very fine. But a lot of it has to do, I think, with anticipation. I think basically if you can give the boost a little sooner, you can do it without actually causing yourself any trouble.
Problem I see with it, and I've got the newest that David had on his site at one point, is that with Panorama at least, it may not occur with Snap, is that as you move your mouse when it's throttled, your mouse starts jumping all over the place because it's hard, it's CPU controlled.
A lot of it has to do with poor implementation in other drivers. This is the law of unintended side effects. So anytime you change something, you just don't know. And I think there's got to have to be work in the mouse drivers. There's something in them that's just not right. And I haven't looked at the code enough, but it just, I've done enough stuff like that, it can be done better.
Well, I'm just saying with Snap, because it's got hardware acceleration, you might not see that. But with Panorama, it's all CPU, so your CPU's down, so it's...
Well, we'll talk a little bit about Panorama and Snap later, too, because I have some thoughts on that, and we'll see. It's still in the planning stages, so we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Okay, what else is there? Well, unintended consequences. We had a Dennis refresh as a result of the AHCI driver. Why? Because Dennis used to live in its own little world. It was the only disk controller. And no one thought about that there was any need. No one, as in Danielle, thought about the need of making sure that no one else had the hardware. So, they were both trying to run the controller for a while there. But it was easy enough to fix. It's just something we needed to do. Another thing that was good, most of us here don't care, but the rest of the world does. The 2.1 English and German basically came out at the same time, which is the first for MLBs. The other ones are still lagging a little bit, but there's work on them. A lot of that has to do with that the translations require a lot of volunteer effort because basically Mensis doesn't have a lot of translators working for it. Okay, let's take a break here. Any other questions on what's new in the ECS 2.1 stuff? Okay. Now, we've been muddling along since 2.1, doing all the usual stuff that we did before 2.1. But one of the big changes, which you should start seeing now, some of you probably already have the data, is we've had a paradigm shift in ACPI in the sense that we have a new developer. And he's doing good work. And things are just getting better. Certainly one thing that's getting better is remember all those switches you had to fiddle with? The vast majority of them are gone now. There's still a couple of them, but they're there because Dave and I can't figure out what they do yet.
They also fixed the Screen 01 manual with that too.
Well, that actually was a serendipity because I was working on that Screen 01 and I knew it was happening. And basically, that's because there is something called a 32-bit bias entry point that's optional in BIOSes. But for some reason, it's deprecated. And a lot of BIOS vendors don't have it. So what Screen01.sys, and actually it's not Screen01.sys, you see the trap there, but it's really, believe it or not, when it's too low, which is implementing OEM help, because that's where OEM help lives. But it makes a call to the video BIOS doing a 16-bit call. And it just so happens that some of these newer BIOSes try to load DS with a selector rather than leaving well enough alone. And of course, that selector is not mapped. So you immediately trap in Screen01.sys. Now, the reason it doesn't happen in OEM help is that function has been rewritten in the OEM help implementation that lives inside of ACPI. So we discovered, just by luck actually, that, we don't have this problem if we go to ACPI. Then we said, that's why. Because we're not going there. But this is the type of stuff that happens. Sometimes it takes a little while. I looked at patching the other OEM help, but it just didn't make any sense because basically any system that has the problem needs ACPI anyhow, so the problem is fixed. We just need to understand why it occurs. When we see it, we know what to look for in the trap screen. Basically, what you do is stop. On the trap screen, it will say that you've got a track D. right? The usual stuff. But the error code tells you the selector is the problem. Most of the time when you get those, the error code is 0. Because
I'm
you're
not
trying
talking about
to jump to 0.
I wasn't talking about the trap. I'm talking about with the original ECS 2.1 ACPI,
Yeah.
you hit screen 01 and it hang there for like 4 minutes.
Oh, that's a different problem. That's probably panoramic and not doing things optimally.
But then when I installed the newer one for the David had done,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, there's lots of stuff. That has to do with the PCI enumeration. There's just a ton of stuff that's changed in there.
On systems that don't require ACPI,
Right?
does the new ACPI driver functionally replace APM?
Yes, it can. Provided the functionality is there. Now, this really almost only matters for laptops. Because the only real big systems that need APM are laptops. Power Manager will work on your dream desktop, but the chances are you really don't need it. You won't see a difference. Because you're not sucking that much out of there, or the stuff that it's going to back off is such a small percentage of your actual current flow that it doesn't matter. You got your 4 SATA drives and your 2 terabyte drives that are grinding away generating heat rather than doing useful work. You cut back the CPU power, which is what, 50 watts total on the CPU, down to 40. It's just not going to make a difference that you're going to be able to measure. But on the laptop, because the batteries are finite resource, it does make a difference. So yes, you can do that. Now, the other thing is, although most systems, the vast majority of systems that don't need ACPI, they actually have a working APM. See the old G42s and stuff like that, where APM works just fine.
But there are some utilities that are available that require ACPI. And it's a trade-off. Either you get to use those utilities like
Temperature, battery.
yeah, like a USB UPS monitor requires ACPI. But if you've got a laptop that runs 150% better using APM, you think, well, what's more important to me? It would be nice if that trade-off no longer was necessary.
Yeah. Well, that depends on 2 things. First of all, people that have need that want to do that, being part of the testing environment, and giving us viable feedback, in a sense, and learning to fish on their own a little bit. They'll get plenty of help, but they also have to actually be willing to learn on their own, because it's not trivial to be a good tester.
Sure.
We need specific types of information, and since resources are limited, we don't really want to have to tell you 10 times what that information is. Twice is okay. Maybe the first time you didn't understand. But so those things are possible. But again, it's going to requires labor on your part. And you well know, Lewis knows I'm not criticizing because he and I have this little discussion. He gets busy. Old problems just until they come and bite it again.
What hang was that?
Yeah, exactly. And, eventually they come back and they hit the top of the pile again. But this stuff is, if it's really critical, it gets fixed. But a lot of stuff is because it happens now and then. It's not destroying data. It's just good patch restarts. That's one of our favorite orders. As long as it doesn't hit any system, we don't care. Because no one's going to notice it.
Exactly.
Hey, it could have been a packet that got dropped that caused that page not to redraw. You don't know.
Question, Steve?
Yeah.
How do we identify a current build?
Build level.
Yeah, but do we download it? An ISO?
Well, current build of what? Now you're talking to apples and oranges.
ECS 2.1. You can get
2.1.
an image for the disk.
Oh, well, when you download, you will get the current ISO. Okay. Now, I think what your real question is, how do I know if the ISO's been updated?
Yeah.
It'll be announced. There probably won't be a refresh of 2.1 for a little while. That's another item that's always under discussion because I wish that you could do refreshes monthly and this sort of stuff. But there's an downside. Someone's actually got to do the refresh work. And also the problem is do you want to do this with limited testing and then have a regression sneak in because it wasn't tested properly?
Did the ISO names change when you changed the...
Oh, sure. We put a refresh out there to go to 2.1. One of the things we used to do, which we avoid now, is anything that goes out has a unique name. And also, even, same thing, used to be that we depend on the data to build level change. And we don't do that anymore. We just bump the version. We bump the third version. It's, a little more work or in place, and it's easy, and it just prevents confusion. For me, the date's fine, but it's not fine for everybody, so we'll make it, I don't care. We'll just do it the way that keeps most people satisfied, that's within reason in terms of labor. Now, in terms of, one thing you can do is if you're wondering when you installed ECS, but you can't remember and you forgot to write it down, just go look at the flag file in your ECS directory. It'll tell you your version, and it'll tell you when you installed it. Now, the benefit of that is you might decide, you tell you when you want to go run checks, ECSMT, and see if there's any updates. But the reality is you don't really need refreshed ISOs unless you have a problem. And typically you'll get a private fix for that anyhow, which will not make it into a tested ISO. Or you're going to update your browser or something like that. And for that, you don't need to reinstall anything. Just download the browser and install it. And the installer, we'll talk about that a little bit. There's going to be some changes over time in how we do installations for a number of reasons. Okay, what else is good? Well, as I was saying about ACPI, the current builds install a lot less user intervention. Most people just drop the DLLs in there, install the WPI, or the RPM, whichever it is at the time, and it'll just go. There's also work, which I didn't mention here, going on actually having a better installer for ACPI updates. Now it's mostly zips. We should really integrate it into the smart guide and provide a WPI. It's just a matter of somebody started working on it and then they got distracted going traveling the world and doing other things that never really got done. It's just one of those things. And it wasn't important. It wasn't important enough. I suspect it'll get more important once we actually start releasing a lot more ACPI updates. Then we'll want to manage that for the user a little better. For now, we're okay. Multi-Mac is moving on. Mr. Multi-Mac over there. We'll be starting to deliver betas once we get the thing to the point where we believe it's sufficiently stable that we're not making more work for us than ourselves than we really need to.
Could you just expand on what that is?
Multi-Mac? You don't know what Multi-Mac is?
Well, it's a network. Think for network drivers, right? For cars or wireless or what is it?
No. Yes. Okay. That can be used. Now, Multi-Mac is basically the new architecture for developing device drivers, network device drivers for VCS. And essentially what we're trying to do is lay out the source in such a way that we can reuse as much as possible. One of the downsides of the IBM EDK for any of us who are developers is that it's really hard to reuse anything because they didn't plan for it. They got header files. There's so much replicated, duplicated code that should be in libraries. And it doesn't matter whether it be source libraries or binary libraries, but it's not in library form where you can just include it and compile it. You have your own little copy with little tweaks and stuff like that. So what we're trying to do with Multi-Mac is not go down that road again. We have common directory, common include, as we identify things that really can be used by everything, all the drivers, it goes in there. And we'll make the implementations more generic. We'll find something that's too specific to a given driver, and we can do the same thing in a more generic way. We'll refactor the code, do the more generic stuff. Now, it's an ongoing process. It's like everything else, a step forward and back, and all that sort of stuff. And we've had some development problems. Unfortunately, the developers we had were not up to the task. But fortunately, we got ones that are now, and we're getting trained, and we're going to start seeing good outcomes. Well, that's the Multi-Mac version. What's currently out there already is the E1000E driver, which works well for pilot. There is an earlier version of the Realtek driver, which does work. I actually use it on my machine, it works fine. Not the betas, but the last binary field that was done as a GA. It works on my system. Now, it's not going to work everywhere, but it's got bugs.
Neil, that's 3 machines now that we know that it works on. So we're
Yeah,
we're good.
I've heard of others.
We're getting there. We just haven't seen them yet.
But it's nothing that I would call production quality. You know, the fact that it happens to work on mine, I think is as much serendipity as anything else. Because you know, the bugs that it has, the memory it's stomping on, just so happens not to matter.
Yeah.
But you know, he put out a bill that worked great on his machine and tracked immediately on rivals. And why? You know, it's just something that didn't matter for his chipset's a little different.
Mm-hmm.
The same old bug, it was stopping on memory, but it was stopping on memory, but it didn't matter. And this is what happens. Even little applications like driver, you can get that happen. But you know, that'll all get cleaned up, and you know, we'll refactor the code, it'll be clean, and what'll happen is the next chips that we need will be easy. And that's also, once we get the Realtek stabilized, we'll probably go back and do a little cleanup on the existing drivers, just to get the benefit of the common stuff and all that, and make it, because otherwise they'll come out with another chipset, we'll do a build that just won't work. But if we clean it up first and throw it out there for a little testing, then the next one will be the big job, which is going to be the wireless. And that's going to require a little thinking, because folks that tried to do the wireless, they were lost. They just didn't know what they were doing. And I don't think we'll be able to retrieve any of that. The Realtek code, at least we got to retrieve most of it. It was dirty, it needed a lot of fixing, but you know, it's stuff that just edited. It's nothing, the problems in there are not design problems. They're more a matter of sloppy silly coding. And those are fixable. You'd really rather you didn't have to waste your time doing it, because it is a time waste, because anybody who knew what they were doing wouldn't have done it that way to begin with. But we don't always get to pick our developers. That's the other thing. In Windows world, right? You know, you want somebody for $15 an hour, you just get one. And you get what you get. You can use Visual Basic and all that sort of stuff, but it's cheap. Okay? But if you want a good driver developer, you don't get them for $15 an hour. In the OS2 world, they're a scarce commodity. So it's just it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
But we've been pretty lucky, because we could have failed totally. You know, but we do have a lot of drivers that are working.
Mm-hmm.
Take a look at what's going on with USB. That's an excellent example of quick progress. You know, we'd like to see it better, but hey, everything takes time. Just the nature of these things.
So far, this is 2 or 3 wired adapters.
At the moment, all we have is wired. I don't expect to see anything serious with the wire for at least another month. At that point in time, I think we should be done enough with the Realtek where we can start doing some real planning of the wireless. The thing with the wireless that makes it different than the wire is that it's a much more complex driver. With the wired drivers, you'll have a very hard time convincing me they shouldn't be 16-bit drivers, even if we import the code from Linux. To make it easy to import is just simply how you import the code. There's some mechanical things you can do that will allow the compiler to tell you exactly where your problems are. I'll give you an example of what happens with the other guys. They try to import some Linux code, and of course, it's C, so it's got a whole bunch of ints. Well, ints can vary on size. The first thing you do is you take every int and you turn it through int 16, because you know that's what it's going to be on your machine. Then you inspect all those int 16s and make sure that they don't need to be in 32s. And then you're done. Period. It's really that easy. Mm-hmm. But you got to know to do that. You got to have that mindset. But this is the difference between the 32-bit and 16-bit driver. You aren't going to run out of data space on a wired drive. They just don't have big buffers. They don't have a lot of dynamic queuing. Now, that's not old. That's a generality. It's not old. Large ran into some trouble with the DHCI driver because of just the way the isochronous needs to handle it. They have basically he needed two 64K buffers, and he didn't know that in the beginning, so he had to go back and fix it. Once he fixes it, it wasn't that big of a deal. Once he identified the problem and he discussed what had to be done. The problem with wireless drivers, they have to do a lot more. And as a result, the code's going to be larger. Maybe that it's going to make sense.
Maybe they wanted 20 minutes.
Now, if we do this 32-bit driver, then we have to decide, okay,
That's
where do we
till
start?
12.
Where do we start? Do we take our 16-bit network driver, put the hooks in there so that it can be called 16-bit and bump to 32? Or do we take the
short on time, so getting short on time.
How much time do I have?
We'll give you 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, then I go fast. But there's architectural things that we need to solve. Okay, what else? This is just more stuff. HDI drivers. Some of you that were running SMP systems were having TCP/IP problems with your browser. You fix that up. NLB's going on. Mozilla applications. They keep getting refreshers, but it doesn't really. That is stuff that Mozilla that's semi-funded by Mensis. Okay, so while you're not going to see anything big until you get the next 2.11 or 2.2 or whatever, all that stuff is happening in the background, and Mensis keeps it doing. Flash development is continuing. AHDI driver, for those of you that care, is going to get smart support. It probably makes some sense because those big drives, when they fail, you can't work. Especially if you haven't been managing it as you go. USB, as we say, is moving along. We've got new X-Workplace development coming along. 3D Workplace, yeah. Split bars can work. Actually does work now. Of course, we're going to do there's a bunch of little cleanup in there. Maybe from a programmer's point of view, we'll actually get a branch onto the trunk. Because we've been loosening on the 1X branch forever. There's some new features in the trunk that make them useful. OpenOffice.org will get a refresh. Java 1.6 is going to get a refresh. This stuff you should all know about. Even more. RPM installers can get used more widely. And, there's a religious war about RPM. And my answer to that is, if you don't like RPM, fix the working first. Because someone's got to hold on and do the code. RPM does a lot of things that we need done. And it's easier to do by integrating RPM than do it with Workday. In terms of everybody's complaining, well, I got this user and the user bin and all that. Well, the answer is you had that already if you were installing Uniport apps. So it's really more of the same. If you were running never ran a GCC-based app or something for Linux, then it's different. Then in that case, you're probably not going to install any of this stuff anyhow, so who cares? But RPM solves the problem. We're talking with Eugene about putting some of the icons in there. And we should probably also be talking about the file open container and a couple other things. Because basically it seems like people don't pick it up on their own. So if we put it in there for them, it makes sense. Thinking about EFI, thinking about USB 3.0, and thinking about greater than 2 terabytes support. There's just a lot of issues there in terms of how do we do it with the minimum amount of bustage and a reasonable amount of development.
What's EFI?
Extended firmware interface. Yeah, look it up on Google. I don't really want to go into too much detail on that. And what can you do? Nothing. Well, learn the code. Now, that's actually too much to ask for a lot of people. But the reality is, once you do that code, you keep your code to yourself. Now, I know. The other thing is, help out in the testing environment. One area that I wouldn't want some help with is I've got a bunch of little readmes. How to set up the process dump. How to set up the process dump, how to set up the track dump. They're on my website. They've been out there forever. They're all targeted at workforce type of theme when I originally wrote the thing. It'd be nice for someone to come along and just change the text so it reads for ECS and points to the places on the ECS CD where the data is and move the old stuff to the appendix. Because, no sense in it. And those type of things end users can do. You don't have to understand it all. 5 minutes of talking with the developer and you know what to change. And the rest of it is just time searching around. And then, last thing you can do, turn the phone. That's it.